In 2008, Iceland had about 320,000 people. That is not the population of a country. That is the population of a mid-sized town. The island sits alone in the North Atlantic, closer to Greenland than to Scotland. Most of its surface cannot be lived on. Lava field, glacier, highland desert, black sand that runs to the water and stops. Two-thirds of everyone on it lives in one corner, around a single harbour in the southwest. There are no mines here, no oil, no forests worth the axe. That same year, 3 banks headquartered in that corner held assets worth roughly 10 times everything the entire country produced in a year. Not 10% more, 10 times. At the end of the second quarter of 2008, the combined assets of Glitnir, Kaupthing and Landsbanki came to more than 14 trillion kroner. The country's external debt stood at around 50 billion euros. The economy standing behind that debt was worth about 8.5 billion. Four years earlier, those same 3 banks had been ordinary. In 2004, their combined balance sheets came to roughly 1 year of national output. An unremarkable number. The sort of figure a small European economy carries without anyone looking twice. By 2008, the figure was near 1,000%. Not over a generation, over 4 years. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one is an exaggeration. Iceland was small in every direction. Its exports were fish, aluminium smelted from ore shipped in from other continents, and electricity sold abroad in solid form. Its entire stock exchange could be printed on a single page, and Icelandic money was buying department stores in London. An Icelandic bank was holding the savings of 300,000 British households. An Icelandic businessman was chairman of a Premier League football club. In 2007, the United Nations placed Iceland first in the world on its Human Development Index. First, ahead of Norway, ahead of Switzerland, ahead of everywhere. 14 months later, the Prime Minister of Iceland went on national television and used the phrase national bankruptcy. So how does an island that size come to owe that much? And who was it that decided to borrow it? The phrase, bigger than the country, is not a figure of speech. It describes a specific mechanical problem, and it is worth understanding before anything else, because everything that follows runs out of it. A central bank can rescue its own banks in its own currency. It can print kroner. If an Icelandic bank runs short of kroner, the Central Bank of Iceland can, in the end, make more. But 2/3 of what these 3 banks owed was not in kroner. It was in euros, pounds, dollars, yen, money the Central Bank of Iceland could not make. To stand behind foreign currency debt, a central bank needs foreign currency reserves, real ones, held in a vault or on deposit somewhere abroad. Iceland's reserves were measured in the low billions of dollars. The foreign obligations they were meant to backstop were measured in the tens of billions. Elsewhere in the world in 2008, governments were saying that certain banks were too big to fail. Iceland arrived at a different sentence. Its banks were too big to save. The distinction is arithmetic, not philosophy. A government can rescue a bank that is a fraction of its economy. It cannot rescue a bank that is several times the size of its economy in a currency it does not issue. Past a certain ratio, the rescue is not expensive. It is impossible. And in October 2008, when the money markets froze and the short-term loans that had funded the whole structure came due, Iceland reached that ratio in the space of 3 days. The version most of the world remembers is that Lehman Brothers fell in New York in September and a small northern island got caught in the wave. That is the spark. It is not the structure. The structure was built at home, deliberately, in daylight, by people whose names are known, and most of it was built on a street about half a kilometre long, in a country with more sheep than citizens. Borgartún runs east from the centre of Reykjavik, parallel to the sea. You can walk the whole of it in under 10 minutes. On one side, low glass and pale stone. On the other, the grey water of Faxafloy Bay, and beyond it, on a clear day, the flat white top of a glacier 90 kilometers away. By 2007, this street had a nickname, the Wall Street of the North. All three of the banks kept their headquarters within a short walk of each other here. Their senior people ate in the same handful of restaurants. Their children went to the same schools. The regulators who supervised them worked a few minutes away. In a country of 320,000, everyone involved in finance could be gathered into one room. Several times, they effectively were. It had not always looked like this. For most of the 20th century, Iceland's banks were state property. They lent to the fishing companies, to the farms, to the cooperatives. Credit was allocated more or less politically, and everyone understood that. Then, through the 1980s and 1990s, that arrangement was taken apart. In 1994, Iceland joined the European Economic Area. That single decision did two things at once. It obliged the country to bring its banking rules into line with the rest of Europe, and it opened the doors to the free movement of capital in and out of the island. Foreign exchange controls were abolished. The krona, which had been managed inside bands, was allowed to float freely in 2001. An inflation target was set, and the state banks were sold. The privatization ran from the late 1990s and finished in 2003. Landsbanki, the oldest bank in the country, founded in 1886, and Búnaðarbanki, which would merge into Kaupthing, both passed into private hands within months of each other. They were not sold to international banks with a century of experience in cross-border lending. They were sold, in blocks, to two groups of domestic buyers with political connections. Bidders who might have brought outside expertise were, in the end, not the ones who ended up holding the shares. There is a phrase that recurs in later Icelandic accounts of this period: handed over on a silver platter. That is a judgment, and judgments can be argued with. What cannot be argued with is the shape of the thing. Two blocks of connected owners took control of a banking system in a country too small to contain a second opinion. Remember that. Who owned these banks, and what the owners could ask them for, turns out to be the whole story. It takes a decade and 2,400 pages to be written down properly. For now, the new owners had a problem, and the problem was arithmetic again. A bank funds itself with deposits. Iceland had 320,000 people. Even if every single one of them handed over every krona they owned, it would not add up to a rounding error on the ambitions now sitting in those glass buildings on Borgatún. So the banks went abroad for the money. Not to depositors, to markets. Bonds sold in Frankfurt and London. Commercial paper, short-term IOUs, 90 days, 180 days, rolled over and over. Loans from other banks on the interbank market at rates that in the middle of the 2000s were remarkably cheap for anyone with an investment-grade credit rating. And they had one. The rating agencies looked at Iceland: stable Nordic democracy, negligible government debt, fully employed, top of the Human Development Index, and gave the banks the paperwork they needed. The money arrived, and once it arrived, it had to be lent to somebody. By the end of 2007, more than half of the bank's assets sat outside Iceland. Branches and subsidiaries in Britain, in the Nordic countries, in Luxembourg. Loans to buyers of European retail chains, European property, European telecoms. The banks had outgrown the island in a literal sense. The island was now the smaller part of them. But before there was any of this, before the glass, before the ratings, before the outward rush, there was one thing the country actually lived on. And it was pulled out of the sea. 15 kilometers off the south coast, A cluster of green and black islands rises straight out of the Atlantic. The Westman Islands, Vestmannaeyjar. Only one of them is inhabited, Heimaey, a harbour town of a few thousand people, wrapped around a bay, with a volcano at one end that opened a fissure across the town in 1973 and buried a third of the houses in ash. They dug it out. They stayed. For 1100 years, this is what Iceland was. Not a financial centre, a place where people went out in boats and came back with fish, and where the size of the catch decided whether the winter would be survivable. Cod, above all, thick-bodied, cold water, slow-growing. A fish that gathers on the shallow banks where the warm Atlantic drift meets the cold water coming down from the Arctic, and that has fed the north of Europe since before anyone was writing the catch down. Dried in the wind without salt, cod keeps for years. It travelled. It became the first Icelandic export of any consequence, shipped to Norway, to England, to the markets of southern Europe, where fish was eaten on more than 100 days of the year. For centuries, the trade was not Iceland's to run. From the early 1600s, the Danish crown held a monopoly on all commerce with the island. One buyer, one seller. Prices set in Copenhagen. Icelanders caught the fish, other people priced it. That monopoly was loosened in 1787 and finally ended in 1854, when the island's trade was opened to all nations. It took another century for the country to control what happened in its own water. It took 3 confrontations with the Royal Navy. Between 1958 and 1976, Iceland pushed its exclusive fishing limit out 3 times. First to 12 nautical miles, then 50, then 200. Britain sent frigates to protect its trawlers. Icelandic Coast Guard vessels ran in behind the British boats and cut their nets with a towed steel cutter. Ships collided. Nobody was killed. Iceland, which had no army at all, held the strongest card on the table, the NATO airbase at Keflavik, and made it quietly clear that the base could be closed. In 1976, Britain conceded. Iceland got the 200 miles. Hold that thought. In 1976, a British government backed down over Icelandic fish. In 2008, a British government will reach for its anti-terrorism legislation over Icelandic money. These two countries have a long memory of each other. So Iceland had won the sea. And then it did something almost no other fishing nation had done. It turned the sea into property. Through the 1980s, catch limits were set vessel by vessel. In 1990, the system was made fully transferable. A quota, the right to land a given tonnage of cod or haddock or herring, could now be bought, sold, leased, and above all, pledged. The economics were sound, and the biology was sounder. Fleets that were too large shrank. Boats stopped racing each other to strip a season in 6 weeks. Catches were set against scientific assessments of the stock instead of against each other. But something else happened at the same time. Quietly. A wild resource that had belonged to everybody and to nobody became an asset with a market price, held by fewer and fewer companies. And an asset with a market price can be carried into a bank. For the first time in its history, Iceland had a large pool of domestic collateral. In the harbour towns, they noticed the other half of that arithmetic. When a quota was sold out of Ísafjörður, or out of a village in the West Fjords, it did not simply change hands. It left. The boats went with it. Then the processing jobs. Then the families. Some of those villages have never come back. Above the harbour at Heimaey, in the short, bright summer, the cliffs fill with puffins. They arrive in April and dig into the turf on the cliff tops, burrows a metre deep. The same burrow year after year, the same partner. The rest of their lives is spent out on the open Atlantic, sleeping on the water, coming ashore only to raise a single chick. A puffin can hold 10 or more small fish crosswise in its beak at once, because the roof of its mouth is ridged and its tongue pins the catch in place while it goes back down for another. It flies at the sea rather than over it. 8 wing beats a second. A bird built for a life spent mostly underwater. In late August, the young leave the burrows at night and follow the moonlight out to sea. Some of them follow the lights of the town instead. For decades, the children of Heimei have gone out in the dark with cardboard boxes, gathered up the ones that landed in the streets, and released them off the cliffs the next morning. A small thing, but it is the older Icelandic arrangement in miniature. Take what the sea offers, count it carefully, put back what you can. Fish was never going to be enough on its own, and everyone knew it. The catch is capped by biology. It does not compound. A country that wants to grow faster than its fish stocks has to find something else to sell. Iceland found 2 things. It sold its rivers, and then it sold its credit. Iceland sits on a seam. The mid-Atlantic ridge runs the length of the island, and everything that makes the place difficult to live on also makes it cheap to power. Rain and meltwater come off the glaciers in glacial rivers that never stop. Heat comes up through the rock, close enough to the surface to boil water for free. The country generates effectively all of its electricity from moving water and underground steam. It always has more than its people can use. Electricity, though, is the one commodity you cannot put on a ship, unless you turn it into metal. Aluminium does not occur as metal in nature. It arrives at a smelter as alumina, a white powder refined from bauxite ore, mined in the tropics, shipped in bulk. To separate the metal, the powder is dissolved in molten salt at nearly 1,000 degrees, and an electric current is driven through it, continuously, for years without interruption. The current is the cost. Roughly 1/3 of the price of primary aluminium is electricity. So a smelter does not really buy power. It buys a place to stand next to power that cannot travel. Iceland understood this early. In 1969, a Swiss company opened a smelter at Straumsvík on the lava plain south of Reykjavik. In 1998, an American company opened a second at Grundartangi on the shore of Hvalfjörður. The arrangement was always the same, and it was frank about what it was. Iceland imports ore it does not have, burns its own rivers through it, and exports the result. What leaves the country in those ingots is not metal so much as electricity, in a form that floats. By the turn of the century, both smelters were running, and the government wanted a third. It also wanted something else: to stop the east of the country emptying out. The east is the far side of the island. Long fjords, steep sides, small towns that had been losing people for decades as the fish moved and the quotas were sold. Egilsstaðir, Seyðisfjörður, Reyðarfjörður, a village of a few hundred at the head of a deep water fjord. In March 2003, a contract was signed with the American aluminium company Alcoa. 40 years of electricity at a price fixed for 4 decades for a smelter to be built at Reyðarfjörður. The power did not yet exist. It had to be made. Karanjúkur sits in the highlands north of the Vatnajökull ice cap, in country so empty that the road to it did not exist before the machines came. 2 glacial rivers were dammed, 5 dams, 3 reservoirs, and 73 kilometres of tunnel bored through basalt to carry the water 40 kilometres east and drop it down a shaft into turbines in the valley of Fljótsdalur. The main dam is 193 metres high. The station generates 690 megawatts, the largest of its kind in Europe when it was finished. The cost ran past $1 billion. The metal that current is sold as leaves through a purpose-built harbour 75 kilometres away, at Reyðarfjörður, where the smelter produces something over 300,000 tonnes of aluminium a year. For the East, the arithmetic worked. In the 6 years to 2008, the population within a couple of hours of the construction rose from around 7,700 to nearly 9,500. 22%. Towns that had been counting down for 40 years counted up instead. And here the two halves of the story collide, because the country this was being built in was not short of work. Iceland in 2005 and 2006 had unemployment of roughly 1%. Wages were rising above 7% a year. The current account deficit was heading toward a fifth of national output. Every economist looking at the numbers said the same word: overheated. Into that, the state and its power company poured the largest construction project in the country's history, and thousands of imported workers to build it. The central bank did the only thing a central bank can do about an economy running that hot. It raised interest rates. By early 2008, the policy rate stood at 15.5%, which was, on paper, a sensible response to inflation, and which was also, to anyone in Tokyo or Zurich with access to cheap money, an advertisement. But the men who would do the most damage were not in Tokyo or Zurich. They were 4,000 kilometres east of Reykjavik, in a bottling plant on the edge of St. Petersburg. It is the winter of 2002. Russia is 10 years out of the Soviet Union, and business there is not for the cautious. In a plant on the industrial outskirts of the city, an Icelandic father and son are making beer and soft drinks. Björgólfur Guðmundsson, once a prominent businessman in Reykjavik, ruined when a shipping company failed in the 1980s, has spent a decade rebuilding in a market where nobody knew his history. His son, Björgólfur Thor Björgólfsson, 35 years old, runs the deals. The brewery is called Bravo. In 2002, they sell it to Heineken. The money comes home. Within a year, the family held the controlling stake in Landsbanki, the oldest bank in Iceland, founded in 1886, the one that had been the national bank. Björgólfur Guðmundsson became its chairman. His son became, by the count of the financial press, the first Icelandic billionaire. At 40, he appeared on the cover of Forbes. It is worth pausing on what has just happened, because it happens twice more in this story, and each time the pattern is the same. A fortune is made abroad in a business that has nothing to do with banking. The fortune comes back to an island of 300,000 people and buys a bank. The bank then borrows on international markets at a multiple of the fortune that bought it, and lends a great deal of that borrowed money onward into ventures owned by people the bank's owners already knew. Remember the brewery. It resurfaces at a football ground in East London, and again, years later, in a courtroom in Reykjavik. In the middle of the 2000s, something started happening on British high streets that nobody in Britain could quite account for. A toy shop on Regent Street that had been trading since the 18th century changed hands. Hamleys. Then a department store group, House of Fraser. Then a jeweller, a fashion group, a chain of frozen food shops that was, by an accident of naming, already called Iceland. behind a striking number of those deals sat one company from Reykjavik, Baugur. Baugur had started as a discount supermarket. Bonus, opened in 1989 by Johannes Jonsson and his son, selling cheap groceries out of a warehouse in a country where groceries had never been cheap, the logo was a cartoon pig. By 1998, the family business had merged upward into a group, and the son, Jon Ásgeir Jóhannesson, had discovered something about British retail that the British had not priced properly. Retail chains own property. Property can be separated from the shops that stand on it, sold and leased back. The cash from the sale services the debt raised to buy the company in the first place. None of that was invented in Iceland. It was ordinary leveraged buyout practice, and half the private equity industry in Europe was doing it. What was unusual was where the leverage came from. The Icelandic banks were lending to the Icelandic investors, and the Icelandic investors were among the largest shareholders in the Icelandic banks. Jon Ásgeir Jóhannesson was the biggest shareholder in Glitnir. The Björgolfur family controlled Landsbanki. The money went round a circle roughly 200 kilometers wide. Kaupthing bought a British merchant bank. Icelandic investors bought two of the great department stores of Copenhagen. And in 2007, Björgolfur Guðmundsson, the man from the St. Petersburg brewery, became chairman of West Ham United. An island with a population smaller than Coventry now had a seat in the Premier League, a shelf of the British High Street, and a bank on Cheapside. The Icelandic press needed a word for the men doing this, and the word it found was not modest. Útrás, the outward rush. And the men who carried it out were Útrásarvíkingar, outvasion Vikings, raiding Vikings. It was, at first, a joke that the country enjoyed. It became official. Government ministers used it in speeches. The president spoke abroad about the particular Icelandic character that made this possible. The risk appetite, bred by 1,000 years on a rock in the North Atlantic. Keep the word in mind. In 14 months' time, it will still be in use, in the same country, by the same newspapers, and it will not be a compliment. None of this so far has touched an ordinary household. Department stores and football clubs are not what most people's lives are made of. But by 2004, the banks had turned inward as well, and what they brought with them arrived at the front door. Reykjavik does not sprawl the way most capitals do. It runs south and east along the coast into a chain of towns that are really the same city. Kópavogur, Garðabær, Hafnarfjörður. In the middle of the decade, those edges filled with new streets. Timber and corrugated steel, painted in the pale colours Icelanders use against a grey sky. 2 cars in the drive, because there is no other way to move here in February. Between 2003 and 2007, house prices in the capital region roughly doubled. The trigger was competition. The State Housing Fund raised its lending, and then the newly privatised banks, flush with money borrowed abroad and looking for somewhere domestic to put it, came into the mortgage market and undercut it. Longer terms, higher loan-to-value, and, for anyone who wanted it, a lower rate, as long as the loan was not written in kronur. This is the part of the story that is usually told wrong. The picture that travelled the world afterwards was of a nation of speculators. Fishermen day trading. Everybody in a new 4-wheel drive. Some of that happened. But for most of the households that were hurt worst, there was no speculation at all. There was a mortgage on a family house in a suburb, or a loan on a car needed to get to work, offered by a bank the family had used for 30 years, at a rate several points below the krona rate, because it was indexed to the Japanese yen, or the Swiss franc, or a basket of both. You did not have to believe anything about global finance to sign it. You had to believe that your own currency would not fall by half. By 2008, Icelandic household debt had reached something in the order of 213% of disposable income. And the currency those debts were measured against was, at that moment, the single most attractive currency in the developed world. Here is the mechanism, because it is the quiet engine underneath everything else. The central bank had rates above 10%, heading for 15.5%. Japan had rates near zero. Switzerland was not far above it. So an investor could borrow yen at 0.5%, convert into kronur, hold an Icelandic bond, and take the difference. It is called a carry trade, and there is nothing exotic about it. It is one of the oldest positions in international finance. Foreign institutions began issuing bonds denominated in Icelandic kronur, sold to investors who had never been to Iceland and never intended to go. In Iceland, they were called jöklabréf, glacier bonds. And here is what the carry trade does while it is running. The buying pushes the currency up. The stronger currency makes the returns even better, which brings in more buying, which pushes the currency higher again. For Icelanders, the effect was immediate and physical. Imports got cheaper every year. A holiday abroad got cheaper. A car got cheaper. By one measure, the average Icelander in 2006 was 3 times better off than in 2003. The krona was not strong because Iceland was producing more. It was strong because money was arriving to earn the interest rate, and money that arrives for an interest rate leaves for one too. The banks knew what they were sitting on. Wholesale funding is nervous funding. 90-day paper has to be refinanced 4 times a year, and if the market ever declines to roll it, the bank has nothing. So through 2006 and 2007, they went looking for the other kind of money. The kind that does not have to be refinanced. Deposits. In October 2006, Landsbanki opened an internet savings account in the United Kingdom. It was called IceSave. It offered a rate above 6% at a time when British banks were offering 4.5%. There was no branch to walk into. There was a website, a name that sounded clean and northern, and a slogan about a clear difference. The money came in astonishingly fast. Around 300,000 British savers. Somewhere in the order of £4 billion. Not only households, charities, universities, police authorities, dozens of local councils, and at least one national audit body put public money into it. In May 2008, the same account opened in the Netherlands and took in more. Now the question that matters, and it is a technical one that almost nobody asked at the time. Was IceSave a British bank or an Icelandic one operating in Britain? The answer was the second. Landsbanki took those deposits through a branch, not through a subsidiary. Under European rules, a subsidiary is a separate company, regulated where it stands, insured where it stands. A branch is the same legal animal as its parent, supervised at home and insured at home. For the bank, a branch was better in 2 ways. The deposits landed straight on the parent's balance sheet, where they counted as stable funding. And there was no separate pool of capital to be trapped abroad. For the depositor, it meant something that appeared in the small print and nowhere else. If Landsbanki ever failed, the first €20,778 of each account would be met not by the British scheme, but by Iceland's own Depositors and Investors Guarantee Fund. At the beginning of 2008, That fund held about 47 million euros. The sum eventually required to cover the British and Dutch IceSave accounts to that level was close to 3.9 billion. Remember the 6%. It comes back in a British Treasury order at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. It is worth stepping outside the story for a moment because of how it is usually framed. Iceland's collapse gets told as an oddity, a strange little island, Vikings and hubris, and a national character that overreached. But there was nothing exotic in the machinery. Every part of it was standard, European, and available to anybody. The branch passport that let a Reykjavik bank take British deposits under Icelandic supervision was the same passport used by every cross-border bank on the continent. The Luxembourg subsidiaries where the structures were housed were the same Luxembourg subsidiaries everyone used. The credit ratings were issued by the same 3 agencies. The commercial paper was bought by the same money market funds. Iceland did not invent a new way to fail. It used the ordinary way, at a scale its economy could not absorb. And because the country was small enough to see all the way through, it is the one place where the whole mechanism was later documented, in public, from end to end. That is the real reason the world knows this story. Not because it was strangest, because it was legible. The first cracks did not appear in October, they appeared in February. Between the 10th of February and the 22nd of April 2008, roughly £1 billion was quietly withdrawn from Landsbanki. Credit default swaps on Icelandic bank debt, the price of insuring against their failure, had become among the highest in the world. Anybody watching the wholesale market could see what it was saying. The banks kept lending, the rating agencies kept rating, the accounts kept balancing, because the collateral on the loan books was largely shares in companies whose value depended on the same banks continuing to lend. Then, on the 15th of September, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy in New York, and the short-term money market that Iceland's entire funding model rested on stopped functioning. Glitnir had €1.4 billion falling due within 6 months, and no way to refinance it. On the 29th of September, the Icelandic government announced it would take a 75% stake in Glitnir for €600 million. It was meant to be a show of strength. It was read as the opposite. If the state was stepping in for the third largest bank, the market reasoned, the other two must be worse. Within days, the funding lines to all 3 were gone. So how does a country lose a banking system 10 times its own size? The answer is that it takes 72 hours. It is the evening of Monday, the 6th of October, 2008. The Parliament has sat through the day and passed emergency legislation giving the Financial Supervisory Authority the power to seize a bank, split it in 2, and put the domestic deposits beyond the reach of the foreign creditors. At 4:30, the Prime Minister, Geir Haarde, addresses the nation on television. He says there is a very real danger that the Icelandic economy could be sucked into the vortex with the banks, and that the result could be national bankruptcy. He ends with 3 words that every Icelander alive that day can still repeat. God bless Iceland. On Tuesday the 7th, the regulator takes Landsbanki. Hours later, it takes Glitnir. On Wednesday the 8th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the British Treasury signs an order freezing Landsbanki's assets in the United Kingdom. It comes into force 10 minutes later. The power used is Section 4 of the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001. There was, in the letter of the law, a case for it. The act was never solely about terrorism. It also allowed action where the Treasury believed harm was being done to the British economy by persons outside the United Kingdom. But the name of the statute was the name of the statute. For a period afterwards, the Icelandic Central Bank, the Icelandic government, and Landsbanki appeared alongside prescribed organisations on a British Treasury list. 300,000 British savers wanted their 6% back. A country of 320,000 people was, in the machinery of British law, being handled as a threat. The same day, Kaupthing's British subsidiary is placed into administration. That severs the last artery. On Thursday the 9th, the regulator takes Kaupthing. 3 banks, 3 days. More than 90% of the country's financial system. What happened to the currency in that week has no real parallel in a developed economy. The krona had traded at around 131 to the euro. In offshore trading, it was quoted at over 300. Foreign exchange dealing in Iceland effectively stopped for weeks. Importers could not buy dollars, and for a short and frightening period, the country, which grows almost nothing, could not reliably pay for food and fuel coming in by ship. The stock exchange lost more than 90% of its value. Inflation ran to 18.5%. Interest rates went to 18%. In November, the government did the thing that no member of the European Economic Area had done in the modern era. It imposed capital controls, a legal wall stopping money leaving the country. And it went to the International Monetary Fund. The last Western European country to have done that was the United Kingdom. In 1976, the same year, and it is not a coincidence of memory, that Britain had conceded Iceland its 200 miles of fish. The numbers that followed are the ordinary numbers of a bad recession, and they are worth saying plainly because they belong to households rather than to banks. National output fell by 6.8% in 2009. Unemployment, in a country that had lived at 1%, peaked at 9.4% in February 2009. People left, mostly for Norway, mostly tradesmen, mostly young. And the loans indexed to the yen and the franc did exactly what the arithmetic said they would do. When the krona lost half its value, the amount owed in kronur on those mortgages and car loans did not fall with it. It doubled. In some cases, it tripled. Families found themselves owing more on a house than the house had ever been worth, on a debt that had been sold to them as the cheaper option. Nowhere felt that harder than the southwest tip of the island. Reykjanes is the peninsula the airport sits on. Lava, moss, steam vents, and the town of Reykjanesbær. For 55 years, the town had lived alongside the American Naval Air Station at Keflavik. Then, in September 2006, the Americans left. The base closed. Several hundred Icelandic jobs went with it, and the housing stock of an entire military town came onto the local market at once. The town's answer was the answer the whole country was giving that decade. Borrow and build something bigger. Reykjanesbær bought the base housing. It borrowed to develop it. And it staked its future on a fourth smelter at Helguvik, a few kilometers up the coast, where construction began in 2008. The smelter was never finished. The foundations were poured, the shell went up, the power contracts never came together, and the project was abandoned over the following decade. For years, the drive from the airport into Reykjavik, the first stretch of Iceland almost every visitor sees, ran past an empty industrial hall on the coast, unfinished, with the sea behind it. The The town's debts took the better part of a decade to work through. Which brings the story to a square in the middle of Reykjavik, about the size of a football pitch, with a statue in it and the Parliament building on one side. Ostervolla. On the 11th of October 2008, 2 days after the last bank was taken, a musician named Hertha Torfason set up a small sound system on that square and invited anyone who wanted to speak to come and speak. A few dozen people came. The following Saturday, there were more, and the Saturday after that. Through November, through December, through the black middle of an Icelandic winter, when the sun clears the rooftops for 4 hours and the wind comes off the bay with nothing between it and Greenland. People brought torches, they lit fires in oil drums, and they brought what they had in the kitchen: saucepans, lids, ladles, baking trays, and they hammered on them outside the windows of the Parliament while it sat. Busa Haldabildingin, the kitchenware revolution. On the 20th and 21st of January 2009, somewhere between 7 and 10,000 people were on that square. In a country of 320,000, that is roughly 3% of everyone alive. The equivalent crowd in Britain would be close to 2 million. They were not asking for a bailout. Iceland had never had the option of one. They were asking a much older question. Who did this, and what happens to them? On the 26th of January, the government resigned. It was the first time in the history of the Republic that street protest had brought a government down. In February, a new coalition took office. And in the same month, the man who had privatised the banks as Prime Minister and was now governing the central bank, Davíð Oddsson, was removed from that post. The word Útrásarvíkingur was still in the newspapers. By the spring of 2009, nobody was using it to mean a Viking. And the loans came back one final time. In June 2010, the Supreme Court of Iceland ruled that consumer loans indexed to foreign currencies had never been lawful under Icelandic law. The judgment did not undo what those loans had done to households over 2 years, but it moved a great deal of the loss off the kitchen tables and back onto the balance sheets where it had started. There was one more thing the country refused to carry. Britain and the Netherlands had repaid their own IceSave depositors and wanted the money back from Iceland, a sum equivalent to a substantial share of national output, to be repaid with interest by a population that had never held an IceSave account. Parliament agreed. Twice. And twice the President, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, declined to sign the bill and sent it to a national referendum instead. In March 2010, more than 9 in 10 voters rejected the terms. In April 2011, after better terms had been negotiated, a clear majority rejected those too. In January 2013, the EFTA Court ruled that Iceland had not breached its obligations by failing to guarantee the deposits. The 6% had finally been settled, 4.5 years after it was advertised. In December 2008, with the wreckage still smoking, the Icelandic Parliament did something unusual. It voted to investigate itself. A commission of 3, a Supreme Court judge, the parliamentary ombudsman, and an economist working from abroad, was given the power to compel testimony, to take documents, and to name names. No government department was excluded. No bank was excluded. No minister was excluded. They were given 16 months. It is the 12th of April, 2010. In a hall in Reykjavik, the Commission delivers its findings to Parliament. 9 volumes, more than 2,000 pages. It goes on sale to the public the same day, and by the evening, people are queuing for it in bookshops. Icelandic radio begins reading it aloud, section by section, for anyone who cannot get a copy. A country of 320,000 people had just produced the most complete public autopsy of a banking collapse that any nation has ever published about itself. The first finding is the one this entire story has been walking toward. The Commission did not put the collapse down to Lehman Brothers. It did not put it down to a global credit crunch, or to bad luck, or to the weather in the world's money markets. It found that the explanation lay first and foremost in the bank's own rapid growth, and in the size they had reached by the time they fell. That is the whole thesis of the boom, written down as its epitaph. The banks grew bigger than the country. Not as a metaphor, as a supervisory fact, as a funding fact, and finally, as an arithmetic fact on the morning somebody had to stand behind them and nobody could. Everything else, the smelter contracts, the department stores, the football club, the mortgages in yen, the 6%, was carried on top of a balance sheet that had gone from 1 times national output per 10 times in 4 years, and had done it on borrowed foreign money that had to be renewed every 90 days. But the Commission found something underneath that, and it is the answer to the question left on Borgartun at the start. Who owned these banks? It found that the largest owners of all 3 of the big banks had abnormally easy access to credit at the banks they own. Read that again slowly, because it is not a figure of speech either. The people who controlled the banks were also, in scale, among the bank's largest borrowers. Loans went out to companies owned by the shareholders who had voted the boards in. And a great deal of that lending was secured on shares, frequently on shares in the lending bank itself. The clearest example of the practice became the most famous legal case in Icelandic history, and it happened 3 weeks before the end. In September 2008, it was announced that a member of the Qatari royal family, Sheikh Mohammed bin Khalifa Al Thani, had bought just over 5% of Kaupthing. It was announced precisely because it crossed the 5% threshold that requires disclosure. To a market losing confidence in Icelandic banks by the day, it read as exactly what it was meant to read as: serious foreign money arriving at the 11th hour to back the largest bank in the country. The purchase was financed by loans from Kaupthing. The bank had lent the money used to buy its own shares. Iceland then did the thing that almost no other country touched by the crisis did. It prosecuted. A special prosecutor's office was created for the purpose and staffed for years. The cases were slow, technical, and fought all the way. In February 2015, the Supreme Court of Iceland handed down its judgment in the Al Thani case. Hreiðar Már Sigurdsson, the chief executive of Kaupthing, was sentenced to 5.5 years. Magnus Guðmundsson, who ran the bank's Luxembourg operation, and Ólafur Ólafsson, one of its largest shareholders, each received 4.5. Sigurður Einarsson, the chairman, received 4. In October 2015, the former chief executive of Landsbanki was sentenced. In 2016, 9 more Kaupthing figures were convicted in a separate market manipulation case. By the end of that year, roughly 30 bankers in Iceland had received custodial sentences for conduct connected to the collapse. Men who had been on magazine covers in 2007 were, by 2016, in a low prison building at Kvíabryggja on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, in a country where almost everyone who came to visit knew them by their first name. The politicians were pursued too, and the result there was thinner. The Commission found that ministers and senior officials had been negligent. One former Prime Minister, Geir Haarde, was brought before a special constitutional court that had never once been convened in the history of the Republic. In 2012, he was convicted on a single procedural count, that he had not held cabinet meetings on the crisis as the constitution required, and no punishment was imposed. And the brewery money, 4,000 kilometers east, ended where it had begun. Landsbanki, the oldest bank in the country, was taken by the state. Björgolfur Gudmundsson lost his stake, lost the chairmanship of West Ham United, and in 2009 was declared bankrupt with debts reported at around 96 billion kronor, the largest personal bankruptcy Iceland had ever recorded. He died in February 2025, aged 84. The 9 volumes are still on the shelf in Icelandic libraries. 2,000 pages, produced in 16 months by a country the size of a suburb, about itself, naming its own. Very few nations have ever done it. None has done it in that detail. That, in the end, may be the more remarkable number in this story than the 10. There is one thing left on the harbour. In January 2007, at the peak, work had begun on a concert hall at Osterhofen, on the water at the edge of the old town. It was to be the centerpiece of a development called World Trade Center Reykjavik, a 400-room hotel, luxury apartments, shops, a car park, and a new headquarters building for Landsbanki. The concert hall itself had been argued about since the 1880s. In October 2008, the money stopped, and the work stopped with it. What stood on the harbour was a steel frame, half-clad, with cranes over it and the sea behind. The bank whose loans were funding it no longer existed. The developer's capital turned out never to have been capital at all. For several months, the country argued about what to do with it, and the argument was not really about a building. Finishing it meant spending public money on a concert hall in the middle of a depression. Leaving it meant a rusting frame in the center of the capital, visible from every street that runs down to the water, for as long as anyone cared to look at it. They finished it. Work restarted in March 2009. The design was cut back, and the materials changed to bring the cost down. The facade, 12-sided glass blocks in colored and mirrored glass, set on a steel grid, the geometry taken from the basalt columns that stand along Iceland's coasts, was built as drawn. On the 4th of May 2011, the hall opened. It is called Harpa. The rest of the development around it was never built the way it was drawn. There is no World Trade Center Reykjavik. Landsbanki never moved in. The hall that was supposed to be the ornament on the boom ended up being the only part of it that got finished. And it got finished by the state after the people who commissioned it were gone. So what does a country live on after it has lost the thing it was living on? The answer arrived from a direction nobody had planned for, and it arrived because of the crash rather than in spite of it. When the krona lost half its value, Iceland stopped being one of the most expensive countries on earth and became, almost overnight, an affordable one. Then, in the spring of 2010, a volcano under the Eyjafjallajökull ice cap put an ash cloud into the jet stream and closed the airspace of northern Europe for the better part of a week. Every news bulletin on the continent led with an Icelandic glacier night after night, and several million people who had never given the island a thought watched it fill their screens. In 2008, around 500,000 foreign visitors came to Iceland. By 2018, the figure was around 2.3 million, 7 times the population of the country, arriving every year at a growth rate that ran above 20% annually for most of a decade. By 2016, tourism was earning about 39% of Iceland's foreign currency, more than fish and aluminium put together, for the first time since the country had records. The capital controls that were meant to be temporary lasted 8.5 years. They came off fully in March 2017. By then, national output had passed its pre-crisis peak. Unemployment was back under 3%. The 3 banks that failed had been replaced by 3 smaller ones, rebuilt around the domestic deposits that the emergency law had ring-fenced on that Monday night in October, and required to hold far more capital against far less foreign exposure. Þingvellir sits 40 kilometers east of Reykjavik, in a rift valley where the North American and Eurasian plates pull apart by about 2 centimeters a year. There is a wall of black rock on one side, a plain of moss and water below it, and at the foot of the wall, a slope where, from the year 930, the free men of Iceland gathered every summer to make and recite their laws out loud, because nothing was yet written down. The ground here is literally coming apart, slowly and by a measurable amount every year. Iceland has been a country of about 300,000 people for a very long time. It has been rich on cod and poor on cod. It has been a Danish trading monopoly, a fishing republic, an aluminium exporter, and for 4 extraordinary years, a place whose banks were worth 10 times everything it made. The banks are gone. The island is not. The fish are still counted before they are caught. The rivers still run through the turbines. And the visitors still come up the road from Keflavik past the shell of a smelter that was never finished. Perhaps what matters is not that a small country once built something far larger than itself. It is that when it came down, they wrote the whole of it into 9 volumes, read it out loud on the radio, and put it on the shelf where anyone could find it. Which is, in its way, the oldest Icelandic habit there is. Say the law out loud, in the open, so that everyone hears the same word.